Hello, and welcome to 5 Minutes of Postgres. Today, we're going to talk about the new pgstat checkpointer view in Postgres 17 and how that changed the pgstat bgwriter or background writer statistics. To start with, this is a blog post by Daniel Westermann on the DBI services blog. In this blog post, Daniel talks about the recent change to Postgres 17, next year's Postgres release, where they've clarified the statistics for the background writer and checkpointer processes in Postgres. To recap, today in Postgres 16, you have a couple of columns in this view. They all relate to write activity in Postgres, but they're different processes in Postgres that are independent of each other. And so the most important thing to understand here for context is that back in 2011, there was a change in Postgres where background writer and checkpointer were split into two separate processes. And as that commit message from back then said, background writer is now a much less important process. Historically, background writer did everything. That's why the stats view was called like that. But in the last 12 years, that's not been the case anymore. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the difference in those two processes is the checkpointer process issues what are called checkpoints in Postgres. These checkpoints occur either on a time-based basis or based on the amount of WAL that has been written. The role of a checkpoint is that you can recover your database after a crash to a consistent starting point where we know the exact state of the data directory. Then we can replay the WAL since that point in time to come to a consistent state in memory. Now, the checkpointer process issues a lot of I/O because it has to do a lot of fsyncs and write data to disk. And so it's something where you do care a lot about how often the checkpoints run, why they run, and you want to spread out the I/O load over time. It's a very important process to monitor from a write I/O perspective in Postgres. Now, the background writer, on the other hand, is a very special purpose process. For that, it's important to take a quick step back and remember how pages work in Postgres shared buffers. When you're making a write in Postgres, the write will update the Postgres WAL, which is the part that's essentially persisted right away in order to guarantee durability. Additionally to the WAL, the shared buffers is also updated. And so you have your page from your table in shared buffers. That one is also updated, but it may not be written to disk yet. And so it's marked as dirtied in the shared buffers. Now, the way how dirtied page and shared buffers can actually move to the disk are one of three ways. Either the checkpointer can do it when it comes time to do a checkpoint, or individual connections can do it. Because sometimes when you're reading data, you need space in shared buffers. And if the only thing that you can evict easily is a dirtied page, then Postgres will actually make a write whilst you're doing a read. And so that second class is actually a very particular odd performance behavior. Sometimes you're doing a select and suddenly you're seeing a write. It's because of that dirtied page in shared buffers. Now last, and that's really where the background writer comes in, the background writer periodically writes out these dirtied pages in between checkpoints. And the motivation there is that it avoids individual connections having that overhead of having to write out a dirty page just to be able to read or write their own data. Now coming back to the change in Postgres 17, we can see that now this is a lot clearer. Instead of having all these rows in the pgstat bgwriter view, we just have statistics around background writer and pgstat bgwriter, so you can know how much the background writer has written. And then more importantly, for the checkpointer, which oftentimes you do need to tune, it is very clear now how many checkpoints were time-based checkpoint versus WAL-based checkpoint, and how long they took and how many buffers they wrote. One other thing I'll mention, this comes back to these three different kinds of ways of how dirtied pages actually get to disk. You'll notice that there's actually two columns here that are no longer in either pgstat bgwriter or pgstat checkpointer. And those are those buffers backend and buffers backend fsync columns. Those two are now removed from bgwriter, and instead you can find that information in pgstat.io. Overall, I think this is a great change. There was some discussion on backwards compatibility issues by breaking monitoring queries, but I do think that making this very clear to end users and saying, if you're interested in checkpointer statistics, look at pgstat checkpointer is a good change and will make it much less confusing for those of us who try to understand when the background writer is active, when a checkpointer is active, or when an individual connection has to make an unexpected write. Thank you so much for listening. This was 5 Minutes of Postgres. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear about next week's episode, and talk to you next week.